that we'll talk about. There's really no specific group that was on the receiving end. Like again, we're going to see with the other judgments. You know, we're going to talk about the inhabitants of the earth. We're going to talk about the followers of the beast and of Satan who are going to be on the receiving end of these judgments. And we didn't see any of that in those first four seals. But instead, those first four seals, really the impression that's left from those is that conquest and war and famine and death are really indiscriminate events that affect both the righteous and the unrighteous, you know, equally. But again, the lesson from that for last week that I hope that you took away from that is that God is in control, right? God is sovereign. God is on his throne. And no matter what takes place on this earth, you know, God is in control. And so that was sort of the take-home message of last week. And if you remember last week when we left off at the end of chapter 6, there was this question that was sort of looming, right? That says that the question was, when the judgment of God comes and from the Lamb, you know, who is going to be able to stand? And sort of the implied thought from that was that nobody can stand. When it comes to the judgment of God and the Lamb, nobody can be able to stand. So we kind of had this cliffhanger that we were left with. And so before the seventh seal is open, which isn't going to happen until chapter 8, in response to this particular question, we have this interlude that takes place in chapter 7. And so it's kind of a break between scroll scenes. So we've got the sixth seal that's been broken, and then we're waiting for the seventh seal. And we've got this interlude or break, which is really a word of encouragement to Christians that are suffering oppression from the forces of evil. And I think I mentioned to you last week, this is in my top 5 of the favorite chapters of all of Revelation. Some great songs that come out of this chapter. I should have had you lead us in one tonight. But the salvation belongs to our God, which I think is one of the greatest songs there is out there. I wish I could sing it and do it justice. But and it's interesting that in all these judgments, in the seal judgments, in the trumpet judgments, in the bowl judgments, every time we get to the sixth one, there's going to always be this interlude that follows them before we get to the seventh. It's kind of a pattern that we'll see that takes place. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and read in chapter 7. And so I'm just going to read the first 8 verses first, and then we'll talk about those and then move on. So starting in chapter 7, verse 1, it says, "After this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing on the land or on the sea or on any tree. And then I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he called out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm the land and the sea. 'Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God.' And then I heard the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. From the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. From the tribe of Reuben, 12,000. From the tribe of Gad, 12,000. From the tribe of Asher, 12,000. From the tribe of Naphtali, 12,000. From the tribe of Manasseh, 12,000. From the tribe of Simeon, 12,000. From the tribe of Levi, 12,000. From the tribe of Issachar, 12,000. From the tribe of Zebulun, 12,000. From the tribe of Joseph, 12,000. And from the tribe of Benjamin, 12,000. All right, so the first thing we see here is that we see 4 angels, right, that are standing at the 4 corners of the earth, and they're holding back 4 winds. And so one thought you may have right away is, I mean, there may have been a lot of things you thought when those first 8 verses, like, what in the world are we talking about here? So what are the 4 winds, right? What are the 4 corners of the earth referred to? Well, 4 corners is kind of like, you think of the 4 corners of the earth like northwest, northeast, southwest, southeast. Four corners basically refers to the universe in its totality. And there's some Old Testament examples that talk about this in Isaiah chapter 11 and Ezekiel 7. When we get to Revelation chapter 20, we're going to see a reference to the four corners of the earth there. The four winds. So what's the four winds? This is actually used elsewhere in the Bible to represent destruction or a judgment of God on the earth. We see it in Jeremiah chapter 49, Isaiah 66, and Jeremiah chapter 4. So I've got Jeremiah 49 here. I'm actually going to read Jeremiah 49:36 from the Message version. I think it kind of gives you a little insight on what four winds. So it says, "Then I'll let the four winds loose on Elam, winds from the four corners of the earth. I'll blow them away in all directions, landing homeless Elamites in every country on the earth." So pretty clear there that four winds is a judgment from God, and that's what we're speaking about here as well. And it's actually a common element of apocalyptic literature. Remember at the very beginning in the introduction, I talked about that there's a lot of apocalyptic books that took place during this time that didn't find themselves in the Bible, but it was a very common form of writing that these Christians were familiar with. And so in apocalyptic literature, and even in a non-apocalyptic book like Jeremiah, the wrath of God is represented by a mighty wind, or the four winds here. So even though these four winds are ready to punish Rome, as who we'll find out the punishment is going to be coming on, even though they're ready, we see here that the angels are holding back the destructive judgment of God. So they're basically just holding these winds back, trying to keep them from destroying the earth. And so the question is, why? Well, that question is answered in 2 and 3. We see that there's a fifth angel that comes from the east that tells them why. He says, "Do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servant of our God." And before we talk about the seal, just a quick note about the land, the sea, and the trees. So again, in apocalyptic literature, very often when God expresses judgment on evil people, his judgment is spelled out on the earth. So like here, the land, the trees, rivers, sea, whatever it might be. In his commentary, he says that this is a symbol that God's judgment is announced, but that the judgment is somewhat limited. So when you talk about the land, it's talking about a limited judgment. We're going to see the difference between a limited judgment and a complete just annihilation as we get later on in Revelation. So let's talk about this seal on the forehead of the servants of God. What does that mean? Well, there's actually a good biblical background to this, and it's found in Ezekiel chapter 9. And so in that chapter, if you're not familiar with it, God's about to punish Jerusalem for their sinfulness. All throughout the Old Testament, God has been dissatisfied with his people, and here Jerusalem is representative of that. So before he decides to punish Jerusalem, he sends this man who's got a writing kit. Some versions refer to it as an inkhorn, and he sends him throughout the city to put a mark on the foreheads of all those who were innocent of the sin of Jerusalem. So the God's people that are innocent of all this wickedness that's going on in Jerusalem, this man puts a mark on them. In fact, in Ezekiel 9:4, it says, "Go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are done in it." And so then, just to kind of summarize, he sends destroyers, this is a vision, throughout the streets of the city to kill everyone in the city who doesn't have this mark on their forehead. And so we see here in chapter 7 what we've just read, right, that the angel orders that the destruction of Rome is delayed until all the servants have been sealed, right? So the purpose of this marking here in chapter 7 is the same as it was in Ezekiel chapter 9 in his visions, is that these people that are going to be sealed are going to be spared the destruction that God has in store for the wicked people. So sealing here is just a sign of protection And so then this really answers the question that we left off at the end of chapter 6, right? Who can stand against the judgment of God? Well, the answer is those who have the mark of God on their forehead. Those are the ones that are going to be able to stand. And so I think it's important to as we've talked about in a lot of these things, that this is symbolic language, right? So we're not talking about a literal mark or seal that we're going to be put on our forehead as a physical sign of the believer, but instead it means that God knows his followers. Heaven's loyal followers, Christians, right, are going to be sealed so that punishments won't destroy them. And there's some good New Testament background to this as well. 2 Corinthians chapter 1:21 says he anointed us, right? He set his seal of ownership on us and put his spirit in our hearts as a deposit guaranteeing what is to come. And then Ephesians 1:13, when you believed, you were marked in him with a seal, the promised Holy Spirit, who is a deposit guaranteeing our inheritance until the redemption of those who are God's possession to the praise of his glory. Remember back in the book of Exodus, right, with Moses and the Israelites in Egypt, remember when they marked the doorposts with blood, right? What was the purpose of that, right? It was the sealing of that doorpost was a sign of God's protection, right? He was protecting the firstborn. If they had that seal on the doorpost, then the angel passed over them and they were protected. It was a sign that God would protect the firstborn. It's also important to note that it's not just the followers of God that are going to be sealed, but we're going to read later on in Revelation that Satan's followers are also marked. And we're going to see that beginning in Revelation chapter 13 and a couple other times later in the book. So then we're told in verse 4 that the total number who will receive this seal is 144,000 people from all the tribes of Israel. So what in the world is 144,000 people, right? I mean, I'm sure all of you are like me. How can we figure this out? So Rubel Shelley, in his commentary, he says he thinks there's three possibilities. He says, one, that they're all the saved of Israel under the Old Testament system. Two, he said, Jewish Christians about to suffer persecution is another possibility. And then the third possibility is that it refers to the entire faithful church of God. And so I think you could see, so we read this list, right, and we're going to talk about this list, but you can see this is a list, right, of the Old Testament tribes. So you can see where the thought might be that this has to do with Jewish people. You know, what the Old Testament tribes were in the Old Testament. This is all the saved under the Old Testament system. I could make sense with that. Or it's talking about Jewish Christians that are about to suffer persecution. I think that could make sense. But the thing, I remember way back in the beginning when we went through the introduction, we talked about how if it doesn't make sense to the Christians of this time that they're writing to, then it's hard to believe that that's what's true. And so think about this. So I think the first two are unlikely because a cryptic reference to Jewish Christians about to suffer persecution in Rome, which is what those first two possibilities could be, would really offer no comfort to the Gentile believers in Asia. All right, and the truth is, during this period of time in Asia Minor, where these letters were sent to, there was actually more Gentile Christians than there were Jewish Christians. So what comfort would that be to them if Jesus is saying, well, it's just a bunch of Jews, 144,000 Jews that are going to be saved? I mean, if I'm a Gentile, that didn't give me any comfort, right? So let's just take a look at this list. And if you're like me, when you read through the book of Chronicles or all those Old Testament books, you're going through the Bible in one year and you get to all those lists and you're just like, you just turning the page because you don't want to read it, right? And so that's kind of the way it is when you get to this list here, right? I mean, it's the same thing over and over again. But it's pretty interesting because even though on the surface it looks like a complete list of the tribes of Judah, or the tribes of Israel, it's really not a complete list. And so let's look at some of the things that aren't normal here. So first of all, normally when you saw a list of the tribes, including the list in Genesis 35 and Exodus chapter 1, in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, every time you saw a list of those tribes, who was listed first? Reuben, always, right? Because Reuben was the oldest. But here, Judah is listed first. And what's important about Judah? Right, that's the tribe of Jesus. So you get the point or the feeling here that those who belong to Jesus may be the most important, and so thus Judah being listed first. Another thing that's kind of interesting is one tribe you don't see in this list is Dan. So Dan's not on here. Why is Dan not on there? Well, one thought is that if you, and you may probably don't remember, but back in Judges chapter 18, the tribe became very unfaithful and fell really into idolatry. And I'd encourage you to go back and read Judges 18 because it's a pretty fascinating story about the wicked things that the tribe of Dan did. And so maybe that's why they were left off. And so the other thing that's kind of interesting about this list is that it includes Manasseh, but it leaves out Ephraim. And so if you remember, when it came to land inheritance, the tribe of Joseph was divided into Manasseh and Ephraim, who both received land. And so when you would look at a list, you'd see Manasseh, you'd see Ephraim, but you wouldn't see Joseph. But here, you see Manasseh, and you don't see Ephraim, but you do see Joseph. So, what's the deal here? And then the other thing that's interesting is that the tribe of Levi shows up on this list. And so normally, when a list included Manasseh and or Ephraim, the list was in reference to land inheritance. Well, the tribe of Judah, if you remember, the tribe of Levi were the priests, right? They didn't receive any land. So why are they on this list? And one thing that's important is that all throughout the book of Revelation, we've even talked about this, there's reference made to that we are a kingdom of priests as Christians, right? The book of Hebrews talks about that. We are the priests, right? The Christians are the Levi in the church today. So I think however you look at this text, it's difficult to see it as a literal listing of the tribes of Judah because it's not a complete list. Ian Fair said this. He says, one can safely conclude, therefore, that John is making a figurative theological point rather than doing literal mathematics. So what's that theological point that he's making here? Well, nowhere in the book of Revelation does Jesus separate the Jews and the Gentiles, right? We never see that anywhere in the book of Revelation. So what I think John sees, and a lot of people a lot smarter than me, see this as well, is that the 144,000 people represents the entire faithful church. So it's all of us. That's who the 144,000 people are. And so the next question is, where did this number 144,000 come from? Well, we see here in the list that there's 12,000 from each tribe, right? So you add that up, 12 times 12,000 is 144,000. But the number 12 is an interesting number, and I think we made a little reference to this when we talked about the 24 elders. It's this, when we get to chapter 21, we're going to see 12,000 is the same number that's used for the dimension of New Jerusalem. So the heavenly dimensions is 12,000 stadia. That's the number that's used. And also, we're going to see in chapter 22 that in the New Jerusalem are going to be all the redeemed of God's people who have God's name on their forehead. So all the people that are sealed are going to be in the New Jerusalem. Rick actually said this. He says he thinks it's the 12 apostles times the 12 tribes of Israel times 1,000 equals 144,000. So why does he say that? Well, if you remember when we talked about the 24 elders, we talked about how, I thought that may be a reference to the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles makes up 24 because it's all the redeemed before Jesus and all the redeemed after Jesus. So, and where do we get that from? Well, if you look at, when we get to chapter 21, we're going to see that the gates of New Jerusalem are named for the 12 tribes, while the foundations are named for the 12 apostles. So both of them are included in the structure of obviously symbolic, right? But they're both included, the 12 tribes and the 12 apostles. So making it a place for all God's people before and after Jesus, all the saved. So those are just a couple of thoughts. So in the end, we know that 144,000 is a multiple of 1,000. And 1,000 is the number for totality or completion. And so how do we know that? Well, here's a good example. Psalm 50, verse 10. So that's that verse, or that says, the cattle on 1,000 hills belong to the Lord. So what's that mean? Does that just mean that there's 1,000 hills of cattle that belong to the Lord? No, it means that all the cattle belong to the Lord, right? So that's why the number 1,000 is used, because it represents totality or completion. All the cattle belong to the God. So that's what the 1,000 here, that's how the 144,000 is arrived at. So the important point is this: however John arrived at this number, it symbolizes completeness. So it's not a literal number, but it's a symbolic number. And so why do I bring that up? Well, just as a side note, some people, as you can imagine, take this as a literal number. One group in particular is the Jehovah's Witnesses, and you may have heard about that they believe that gathering a group of 144,000 people prior to Christ's second coming is part of their evangelistic task. And so they actually refer to those 144,000 faithful Christians as the anointed class. And they believe that they're going to be resurrected to heaven, while the rest of us are going to be in this sort of paradise on earth. So anyway, I obviously don't believe with what they believe, but I just say that to point out that this is a symbolic number, okay, not a literal number. So here's what it really means, okay, that God is not going to lose a single saint when all evil plays itself out. Some Christians are going to die. They are not going to be physically protected on this earth, right? But they are going to be sealed against all the unsealed evil on the earth. And they're going to be saved, and we're going to be saved because God knows who we are. So don't get caught up in, if you don't understand what I'm saying or don't even agree with what I'm saying, don't get caught up with this 144,000 and how it got there. The important thing is that God knows who are His, right? We're sealed, and He's not going to lose one of us, right? And so that's the important point. And this is also, I think there's a good verse in 2 Timothy that kind of makes this point here. So 2 Timothy 2:19, nevertheless, God's solid foundation stands firm, sealed with this inscription, the Lord knows those who are His. So in other words, when the last day's in, no matter what happens between now and then, God's not going to lose a single faithful follower of Jesus. That complete number He knows perfectly. And to God, that's an exact number. And that's really what this 144,000 means. It's a complete, total number. Okay? All right. Any questions about that? All right. Let's move on then. We'll read the rest of chapter 7 here. All right. So it says, after this I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and were holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. All the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders and the four living creatures. And they fell down on their faces before the throne, and they worshiped God, saying, Amen, praise and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength be to our God forever and ever. Amen. Then one of the elders asked me, these in the white robes, who are they and where do they come from? And I answered, Sir, you know. And he said, these are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore they are before the throne of God and serve Him day and night in His temple. And He who sits on the throne will shelter them with His presence. Never again will they hunger. Never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. All right. So now we kind of have a different scene here, right? So John turns now from viewing those sealed servants on earth, right, the 144,000, to now he looks and views this heavenly multitude of sealed servants of God in heaven. And so this seems to, in my opinion, be another scene describing the 144,000 people, not another group. So, in other words, the redeemed were identified as an assembly of 144,000 in those verses 4 through 8 that we read. And then here in verse 9, they're identified as a great multitude. But again, I believe that it refers to the same group of people. It's just we're viewing them from a different perspective. So what is that perspective? Well, as we know, the 144,000 that we talked about are God's faithful servants on earth. But what happens here? So now the viewpoint we see is that this great multitude in verse 9 are in heaven, right? They've already overcome and entered eternity with God. So they may not have escaped the first death, but they have escaped the second death, which Jesus says is the only death that matters. And we talked a little bit about the second death earlier a few weeks ago. So these are an innumerable group, multitude, and it says they're from every nation, tribe, people, and language, not just one. Remember back in chapter 4 when we looked at the Lamb, chapter 4, verse 9, it says, Jesus purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation. I may have said that, may have been 5, verse 9 that was in. But remember, Jesus purchased people from these are the exact same words here, every tribe and language and people and nation. And so what do we see about this great multitude? It says they're dressed in white robes and they're holding palm branches, which the palm branches signify triumph or victory. And so in verse 14, we see that they're identified as those who have come out of the great tribulation and have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. So remember last week when we were talking about the martyrs that were under the altar, what were they given? They were given robes. And remember back in chapter 3, verse 5, the conquerors were promised to be dressed in white. And so I think this should be an encouragement to us as a church, and an assurance to us as a church, the church on earth, that the same God who had seen this great multitude here through their time of trials was now keeping watch over the persecuted church on earth, right? The 144,000 that's on earth. And so notice one other thing about this great multitude in verse 9. It says they're standing. And so remember that question at the end of chapter 6 was, who can stand against the wrath of the Lamb? And so the answer is everyone, this multitude, right? Everyone who's given or who's wearing the right white robe that's given by the Lamb. And so we see here that this multitude rejoices in verse 10. It says, and they acknowledge their source of victory. It says they cried loudly, singing the song of salvation. Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. And just to point here, Caesar was just all over these people on earth, and he's telling them that he's the one that can save them. But this multitude is saying here that salvation belongs to God and to God alone. And so we see in verse 11 that all the angels are standing around the throne in the presence of the elders and the 4 living creatures. They fall on their face and they worship God, and they sing a song of agreement, and they say, Amen, praise and glory and wisdom and thanks and honor and power and strength be to our God forever and ever. Amen. And notice how many qualities are ascribed to God here, right? 7. Remember back in chapter 5, the 7-fold praise of worthiness to the Lamb. I don't think this is, there's a reason why the number 7 is used here. in these qualities. So then in verse 13, we notice that one of the elders asked what seems to be a strange question to John, right? It's what I would call a rhetorical question. He says, "Those in white robes, who are they and where did they come from?" And John says, "Sir, you know." And so obviously from the answer that he did know who they were, right? Because he tells John right away. So really I think the purpose of his question here was not information, because I think everybody in heaven knew who this group was. But instead I think it's to call attention to the means by which these people had been delivered and the means by which they had been saved. And so notice that he says that they had come out of the great tribulation. So what's the great tribulation? Rick actually said this. He says, "I think we have all come through the great tribulation." It's not some future event. And again, this is important to point out, because there are some groups, the premillennialists, the dispensationalists, that when they talk about the future, they believe that there's going to be this future tribulation that's going to take place on the earth. And in fact, they actually believe that the 144,000 people are the ethnic Jews who are going to convert to Christianity during this tribulation. And then this great multitude, they believe, are the non-Jews who will convert to Christianity during this same period. And again, I don't agree with that. As I told you, I think this is the same group of people, the 144,000 and the great multitude. It's just looking at them from a different perspective. From one's on the earth and the other is in heaven. And so this great tribulation, what is it? Well, in the King James Version, in John 16:33, Jesus says, "In this world you will have tribulation." Remember back in chapter 1, John said that, at least when you look at the King James Version or the Revised Standard Version, John says that he was their companion in tribulation. And then, I lost my place. And then also he told the church in Smyrna that you are about to face great tribulation. Actually, he said for 10 days you're going to go through tribulation. And so I think we would all agree that all over, maybe not us as much, but all over the world right now, right, there's Christians that are facing great tribulation. And so the point is, just like this great multitude, we can come through that tribulation standing as well. And then finally, at the end here, we see that the great multitude is blessed. And I love how Edward Myers, in his commentary, points out the 6 blessings that this group receives. And so, first of all, they have perfect communion, meaning they are, because it says here, they are before the throne of God. They have perfect service. It says they serve him day and night in his temple. And they have perfect protection. It says he will shelter them in his presence. They have perfect provision. Never again will they hunger, and never again will they thirst. They have a perfect life. It says the Lamb is at the center of the throne. The Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will lead them to springs of living water. And then finally, they have perfect joy. It says, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. All right. Any questions about chapter 7 before we move on to chapter 8? Yep.
Why didn't John just say all the followers, past, present, and future? God knows them. He knows who they are. He's got them all numbered. Not one person's going to be left behind. So it's like, and instead of doing it this way.
Yeah, I think you could say that about the whole book, right? Why is it written that way? You know, and again, it's hard for us to understand it because we're not familiar with this kind of literature. But from about 200 years before Christ to about 200 years after Christ, this was a common form of writing, and so it was meant to be an encouragement. And so I don't know that I can answer that question. I mean, it would be much easier, right? But again, I think I think there's just so much encouragement to be had, even if we don't understand exactly what's going on. I mean, the point is that there's a blessing to be had for the followers of Christ, right? Yes, sir.
Rome doesn't have much of a sense of humor, so he got the couch in didn't mean it.
Yeah, so that's another point too. To try to maybe disguise it from Rome. I guess that's a thought as well. Although I do think that it would be easy for Rome to figure out what's being written about here. I believe, but I do think that's a good point. So, any other questions? So what I want to do, I want to get into just the seventh seal here in chapter 8, because I think it'll be a good starting point before we get to the trumpet judgments. And so now that this interlude is over, and the church is assured of God's care and concern through this crisis, it's time for the seventh seal to be opened. And so this seventh seal is actually a transitional seal from right into the trumpets. I think one important point to point out is that the book of Revelation is not meant to be studied like one verse at a time. It's really like a movie almost. And so there's scenes that need to be studied. And so we're about to enter into a scene that goes all the way through chapter 11. It takes that long to get through the 7 trumpets. And so I would encourage you before I think we're eating next week, so before week after next, to read through chapter 11 to kind of get the big picture of kind of what's being talked about. So let me read these first 5 verses of chapter 8, and we'll get into this real quick. All right, so it says, when he opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. And I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given them. Another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all God's people on the golden altar in front of the throne. And the smoke of the incense together with the prayers of God's people went up before God from the angel's hand. And then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and hurled it on the earth. And there came peals of thunder and rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. And I'll read verse 6 too. It says, then the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to sound them. So we see here that at the beginning, when this seal is opened, that there's silence in heaven, right? And it reminds me, I don't know, probably most of you have lived through a hurricane or maybe been near a hurricane. Remember when I was in med school and Hurricane Andrew we were in New Orleans, was bearing down in New Orleans, and so everybody was saying, this is good, this is it, this is Katrina, 10 years before it happened. And so everybody needs to get out of New Orleans. So we evacuated New Orleans and went to Baton Rouge to Janice's parents' house, and sure enough, the storm just turned right over Baton Rouge, and missed New Orleans. But I remember that night when it came over and the front part of the storm, hit, and then you get to that eye of the storm. If you've ever been in that, it's so eerie. It's like everything is just quiet and calm until that back half hits, and then it's like everything breaks loose, And so that's kind of what I think we see here once this seal is open, is that there's this quietness in heaven. It says there's silence in heaven for a half an hour, and half an hour just means it's a short period of time. So there's a short period of time that there's quiet here. And I tell you that there's a lot of different viewpoints about Revelation. I don't agree with all of them. And one viewpoint is that since there is silence in heaven for a half an hour, that I think mistakenly they point out that they say that there's going to be no women in heaven because of that. I'm joking. That's a joke. I believe there's going to be women there. That's right. All right, so seriously, so this dramatic silence before the storm emphasizes the importance or the impact of these judgments that are about to be revealed. So those 4 winds that are being held back are about to be released. And so this important event that's about to take place, or this silence kind of adds sort of dramatic effect to what's going to happen. And there's a couple of Old Testament examples of this. Zephaniah 1:7 says, be silent before the Lord, for the day of the Lord is near. Zechariah 2:10 through 13, verse 13 says, be still before the Lord, all mankind, because he has roused himself from his holy dwelling. And then Habakkuk 2:20, which is probably familiar to most of you, the Lord is in his holy temple. let all the earth be silent before him. So when God's judgment comes on the entire earth, or when God's judgment comes, the entire earth is to be silent and hold their peace. And so we see in verse 2 that 7 angels were given 7 judgment trumpets to blow. And I love verse 3. This is really wanting to get to this tonight because this is one of my favorite verses there is. So it says, another angel with a golden censer stands at the altar, and he was given much incense to add to the prayers of God's people. That's what the New American Standard Version says. The Revised Standard Version says he was given much incense to mingle with the prayers of God's people. And so Bruce Stewart, in his commentary, he says that he thinks this much incense may mean that this is intercession being added to our prayers. So, and I think this is biblical. Hebrews 7:25 talks about, it says, therefore he is able to save completely those who come to God through him because he is always lives to intercede for them. Jesus is our intercessor. And of course Romans 8:26 and 27 talks about how the Holy Spirit intercedes for us. So I think that's a pretty cool thought to think about, maybe this incense being intercession that's added to our prayers. But this is what I really love. So it's like we see in verse 4, the prayers of God's people went up before God. And it's like these prayers are mixed with incense, and God's just inhaling or smelling the prayers of his people. And so I think that these prayers and these 7 trumpets, it's like the 7 trumpets are coming, and it's God's answer to the prayers of his people. So these prayers ascended to God, right? He's smelling, he's inhaling our prayers, and they're collected, incense is added, and they're presented to God in that way. And to me, it's such a comforting thought to think about your prayers and how they're presented to God. You know, that God, you know, he smells and inhales our prayers like incense. He loves when we pray to us, and he acts because of our prayers. So, and then in verse 5, we see that fire was added, and they were cast back down to the earth. And it's probably why in 5 of the 6 trumpet judgments that we're going to read about, fire is mentioned. And so the same censer that's used to offer up the prayers of the saints is used to cast down fire on the earth. And we see here that there's thunder and lightning. So remember back in chapter 4, I talked about how that symbolizes the power and majesty of God. And I told you back then that later on we're going to see that an earthquake is going to be added to it. And so we see this here, that earthquake is added to the lightning and the thunder. And that means that God's judgment is coming. Greg Stevenson says this in his commentary. He says, the fire cast down on the earth is the fiery judgment of God poured out on those who oppose his kingdom and his faithful witnesses. And the 7 trumpets that follow depict in more detail this outpouring of judgment. And then I love what Rick Ashley says about these verses. He says, heaven has been loud every time we have heard about it. When angels talk, it's loud. When saints worship, it's loud. When they play the harp, it's loud. And when there are earthquakes and lightning, it's loud. But suddenly it gets quiet in heaven. Why? Because God is listening to the prayers of the saints. And so I think the main point that we need to understand from this first part here is the power of our prayers, right? So one of the reasons that these trumpet judgments are going to sound is because Christians are praying. You know, we talked about last week the prayers of the margin of the altar. They were praying to God, how long, God, until you avenge our blood, until you give us justice? And so now we're seeing here, we see in verse 6 that the 7 angels stand ready to sound the trumpets. And so that's what we'll get into. That's what the rest of chapter 8 through chapter 11 is all about, and that's the trumpet judgments. All right, any questions? We made it through a chapter and a half. Well, not even, I guess not a half a chapter, but more than one chapter. All right. Thank y'all for being here. And again, if you got questions, email me or text me. My phone number is in the bulletin, so if you don't feel like answering here, again, sometimes I think if I get some questions, I can incorporate it into the lesson the next week would be a good way to answer, because I know it will give you a lot of time to ask questions. So thank you all for your attention. Appreciate it.
Doc, do you have outline for chapter 6?
I do. Mhm.